Hey everyone, welcome back. Are you ready for a deep dive? We're tackling a huge topic today. British rule in India.
It's a big one, for sure.
Yeah, we're talking centuries here, from before the British even arrived, all the way to independence and partition in 47.
A lot to unpack.
Definitely. So we've got this incredible collection of historical accounts, research papers, firsthand stuff. We're going to dig into it all, see what we can learn.
I'm excited to see what we uncover. There's so many fascinating layers to this story.
Absolutely. How did a trading company end up ruling a subcontinent? What about figures like Gandhi and Tipu Sultan? And partition, what a dramatic ending to this whole era.
Each one of those could be a deep dive on its own.
Seriously. But before we even get to the British, let's set the scene. What was India like before they showed up?
Well, it wasn't this unified monolithic entity,
Like one big empire.
No, not at all. It was a dynamic mix of regional kingdoms, each with its own ambitions. The Mughal Empire, which had been dominant for centuries, was in decline.
So kind of a power vacuum, ripe for the taking.
Exactly. And into this vacuum came the Europeans, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and of course the British.
And how were these Europeans seen at first? Like conquerors?
Not quite. Think of them as just another group of traders seeking their fortune in a bustling marketplace.
Merchants looking for a good deal. Spices, textiles, precious stones, all those exotic goods.
Exactly. They were just players in a complex and vibrant world, at least initially.
And speaking of merchants, we can't forget about the infamous British East India Company.
Ah, yes, the EIC. Doesn't exactly scream imperial powerhouse, does it?
More like a tea party than an empire. But seriously, how did they go from selling spices to ruling a subcontinent? That's quite a leap.
It was a gradual process, believe it or not. The EIC was unique. Imagine a modern corporation with the power to raise an army, print money, and negotiate treaties with nations.
Whoa, wait a minute. Like a company acting like a government?
Pretty much. They had quasi-governmental powers. They started with trading posts called factories in places like Surat, Masulipatam, and Bengal.
So, familiar names from those history books. But how did these trading posts transform into centers of political power?
As the Mughal Empire weakened, these regional kingdoms started battling each other. The EIC saw an opportunity. They started playing the political game, forming alliances, backing certain rulers against others.
Smart strategy. Divide and conquer.
It's a calculated move, and their military involvement grew, especially during those Carnatic Wars with the French.
Ah, yes. The Carnatic Wars. Those were essentially extensions of European power struggles playing out on Indian soil, weren't they?
Precisely. A reminder that these were global rivalries with far-reaching consequences. And one of the most significant moments in this whole saga was the Battle of Plassey in 1757.
Plassey, yeah, that's a name that pops up a lot of the sources. What made it so crucial?
It's often seen as the turning point. You have the EIC, led by Robert Clive, going up against Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal.
High stakes.
Absolutely. And the deciding factor, betrayal. One of the Nawab's own commanders, Mir Jafar, switched sides, joined the British.
Wow, a risky move for Mir Jafar, but I guess he saw an opportunity. What happened next?
Well, the British won, and this victory was huge EE. It wasn't just about territory, it was about gaining control of Bengal, the wealthiest province in India. This win basically gave them the resources to fuel further expansion.
So the EIC went from traders to rulers, all thanks to this pivotal battle.
It was a game changer, and it set the stage for some pretty ruthless expansion, too.
Right, they weren't exactly known for playing nice.
Not always, that's for sure. They faced some tough adversaries, though, like Tipu Sultan in Mysore.
Oh yeah, the Tiger of Mysore.
Yeah.
Known for his military skills and his, well, let's say creative diplomacy.
He even tried to get Napoleon on his side, a visionary in a way. But ultimately, the British prevailed. They also clashed with the Marathas, another powerful force, and the Sikhs in Punjab.
So one victory after another, expanding their control bit by bit. They had some pretty clever policies for consolidating their power too, didn't they?
They did. The doctrine of lapse, for example.
Ah, the doctrine of lapse. The sources describe it as a rather cunning strategy for grabbing more land. Can you explain how it worked?
It basically allowed the British to annex princely states if the ruler died without a male heir.
So a convenient way to expand their territory.
Exactly. And while they claimed it was all about good governance, it clearly fueled resentment among the Indian population.
Right, not exactly a recipe for peace and harmony.
No, by the mid-19th century, tensions were boiling over. Political dispossession, economic exploitation, religious anxieties. It was a powder keg waiting to explode.
And that leads us to the 1857 revolt, which some call the Sepoy Mutiny. But the sources suggest that mutiny doesn't really capture the scale of what happened.
It was a massive uprising, fueled by decades of pent-up anger and frustration.
So what was the spark that ignited this firestorm?
Well, the immediate trigger was the controversy over the new Enfield rifle cartridges. Rumor had it that they were greased with animal fat, which was deeply offensive to both Hindus and Muslims.
Yeah, that would definitely cause some outrage. But this wasn't just about cartridges, was it? It was about something much deeper.
Absolutely. The cartridge controversy was the spark, but the fuel was the deep resentment against British rule itself.
It was a rebellion against the entire system. And some incredible leaders emerged during this revolt, didn't they? Rani Lakshmibai, Nana Sahib, Bahadur Shah Zafar. Their names are still legendary in India.
They are symbols of resistance, each fighting against overwhelming odds. They embodied the spirit of defiance that was spreading across India.
Their stories are amazing. The Queen of Jhansi leading cavalry charges, Nana Sahib fighting to reclaim his lost inheritance. It's like something out of a movie. So how did this rebellion play out?
The fighting was fierce, and for a while it seemed like the British might actually lose their grip on India, but in the end, they managed to crush the revolt.
A brutal suppression, from what I've read. But even though the rebellion was ultimately defeated, it had some lasting consequences, right?
Definitely. The British East India Company was dissolved, considered too unwieldy, and, let's be honest, too prone to excesses.
So, the end of an era for the EIC. But what happened next? Did the British just pack up and leave?
Not quite. Power was transferred directly to the British Crown, marking the beginning of the British Raj.
So the revolt failed to drive out the British, but it did lead to a major shift in how they ruled India.
It was a new era of direct rule from London, with a viceroy representing the Queen. This marked the beginning of a period of significant change and upheaval, which we'll dive into next time.
Stay tuned, folks, because things are about to get even more interesting. All right, so we're back, and the fight for India's independence is in full swing, but things are getting, well, kind of messy.
Definitely more complex.
Yeah, divisions within India are intensifying, leading to one of the most, tragic events of the 20th century.
Partition.
Exactly. The sources paint a pretty heartbreaking picture of what happened. What were the key factors that led to this?
Well, you got to remember, the seeds of partition were sown long before 1947. Policies like the Morley-Minto reforms back in 1909.
Those ring a bell, vaguely.
Yeah, they created separate electorates for Muslims. Well-intentioned, maybe, but...
But they ended up reinforcing religious divisions, right?
Unintentionally, yeah. And as the independence movement gained steam, these divisions became even more pronounced.
So you have the Indian National Congress, mostly Hindus, pushing for a unified, independent India.
Right. And on the other side, the Muslim League, increasingly led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, demanding a separate Muslim state.
What a dilemma. Fighting for freedom from the British, but then also fighting amongst themselves about what a free India should even look like.
It was a really turbulent time. And things like the Cripps mission in 42 didn't exactly help.
Cripps mission. Refresh my memory.
The British, desperate for India's support in World War II, offered some vague promises of dominion status after the war.
Not exactly a concrete offer, huh?
No. Neither the Congress nor the Muslim League were buying it. Felt like too little, too late.
Yeah, I can see why. Each side felt like their core demands were just being ignored. So tensions are rising, and you have these competing visions for India's future. Then World War II ends, the British Empire is weakened, and India's independence becomes almost inevitable.
Right, the pressure was immense, and that's where Lord Mountbatten comes in.
The last viceroy of India. What a tough job he had.
Talk about a challenge. Overseeing the transfer of power, granting independence, but the situation he walked into was a complete powder keg.
The sources describe some horrific communal violence breaking out around this time. Hindus against Muslims, Sikhs caught in the middle. Just awful.
It was a dark period. Riots, massacres, mass displacements, especially in Bengal and Punjab. Millions fleeing their homes, fearing for their lives.
It's hard to even imagine the terror and suffering. Did this violence, this chaos, convince Mountbatten that partition was the only way out?
A lot of historians argue that, yeah, faced with this escalating violence and the seemingly impossible task of reconciling these competing demands.
Partition seemed like the least terrible option.
Tragically, yes. So in June of 47, the Mountbatten Plan is announced, outlining the division of India into two separate dominions, India and Pakistan. A momentous but deeply sorrowful moment.
It must have felt like a huge loss for many, even as they celebrated independence.
Absolutely. The dream of a unified India was shattered, and the plan was implemented so hastily, borders drawn in just weeks, just added to the chaos.
Leading to even more suffering. Families torn apart, communities destroyed. The human cost is just incalculable.
The sources describe these horrific scenes of mass migrations, people desperate to reach areas designated for their religion, facing violence and uncertainty along the way.
Just devastating. Freedom achieved, but it's such a terrible price.
A bittersweet victory, for sure. Nehru's famous speech, Tryst with Destiny, it captures that mix of hope and sorrow so perfectly.
Independence intertwined with the trauma of partition. And the consequences of that trauma continue to this day, don't they? The relationship between India and Pakistan.
Still so fraught. Wars, territorial disputes, that lingering shadow of religious tension. The partition left a deep wound that hasn't fully healed.
It's a stark reminder that freedom often comes at a cost, and the path to nationhood can be incredibly complex and painful. As we head into the final part of this deep dive, I think it's important to consider the broader legacy of British rule in India.
Yeah, it's not a simple story to tell.
Not at all. Exploitation, political manipulation, the violence of partition. But there's also the impact on India's institutions, its infrastructure, its very identity.
So many layers to untangle.
Exactly. And in the next part, we'll do just that. We'll explore the lasting echoes of British rule in India and try to understand how this period continues to shape the nation today. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into British rule in India. We've covered a lot of ground, from the East India Company to partition.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. But now I think it's time to tackle the big question. What's the lasting legacy of British rule in India? How is this period still shaping the nation today?
It's a question that requires nuance, you know?
Right, not just a simple list of good and bad.
Exactly. We need to look at how those aspects are intertwined and how they're still playing out in India today.
Absolutely. So maybe let's start with some of the positive aspects, the developments that emerged during British rule.
Sure.
The sources highlight infrastructure, for example. The railways, they really transformed India, didn't they?
They did. I mean, think about it. They were built for troop movement, resource extraction, to serve British interests.
Right, classic colonialism.
But they ended up connecting different parts of India in a way that had never been done before. Increased trade, communication, even a sense of shared identity.
It's almost like they accidentally created the conditions for a more unified India.
It's one of those unintended consequences of history. And the railways were just one part of it. There's also the postal system, the telegraph, the development of roads and canals. All of these contributed to modernizing India's infrastructure.
And what about the whole administrative and legal framework the British put in place?
Oh, that's huge, too. The civil service, the legal system, the idea of a unified judiciary.
Things we kind of take for granted today.
Right. Independent India inherited all of that. They adapted it, of course, shaped it to fit their own needs, but it provided a foundation.
It's fascinating, right? The British designed this system for their own benefit, but it ended up playing a key role in the development of a modern, independent India.
It's one of the many paradoxes of this period.
But let's not forget the darker side of the legacy.
Right. There's no escaping that.
The economic exploitation, the drain of wealth, as Dadabhai Naoroji so powerfully described it.
It's a crucial part of understanding this period. British policies systematically extracted resources from India, enriching Britain while hindering India's own economic growth.
And those devastating famines in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Tragic examples of how colonial policies exacerbated these crises. Millions of lives lost, not due to natural disasters, but because of policies that prioritized British interests.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of colonialism.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole issue of cultural disruption, isn't there?
Absolutely. The imposition of Western education, the suppression of local traditions, languages. It had a profound impact on India's cultural landscape.
Like they were trying to reshape India in their own image.
There was definitely an element of that. Promoting Western values, dismissing Indian traditions. It created a complex cultural dynamic that continues to be debated today.
And while English did open some doors, it also came at the expense of local languages, didn't it?
It did. It created a kind of linguistic hierarchy that marginalized those who didn't have access to English-based education. Another one of those unintended consequences.
Progress and loss intertwined. It seems to be a recurring theme in this whole story.
It does, doesn't it?
And, of course, we can't talk about legacy without mentioning partition.
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room. The violence, the displacement, the trauma. It continues to shape the relationship between India and Pakistan to this very day.
Such a painful legacy, and one that's so deeply intertwined with the end of British rule. So we're left with this incredibly complex and multifaceted picture. How do we even begin to make sense of it all? What does it mean for India in the 21st century?
I think it means recognizing that the experience of colonialism is deeply embedded in India's DNA, so to speak.
In every aspect of the nation.
Exactly. It's in the institutions, the infrastructure, the languages, even the ways in which Indians see themselves in the world. It's a source of both strength and struggle.
It's a reminder that the past is never truly past. It's always there, shaping our present.
It is. And I think the key takeaway is that we need to keep learning from it, keep grappling with its complexities.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating, albeit sobering, journey.
It has.
I think we've all learned a lot about this complex and crucial period of history. To our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into British rule in India. And remember, The quest for knowledge never ends. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly,